So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also to ASPI for hosting me. They've been just an incredible organization in the past. There's just great hospitality. I also want to give a particular shout out to whoever was the illustrator for the cartoon for the conference. I don't think if you noticed it, but if you go on the website, you can see it even better. You have Trump yelling. You have China's leader holding all the cards, and under the table there, Putin is holding a smartphone, likely carrying out disinformation. So I think it's really appropriate. And it goes to the topic that I'm here to speak to you on, which is essentially what happens in terms of changes in the internet, but also the threatscape and its impact on the world. And the starting point for this is actually a little over 50 years ago, a memo went around the Pentagon, and it proposed the revolutionary idea at the time that computers could not just be big calculators, but rather they could be, in the words of the memo, communication devices. And even more, those computers could be lashed together, not one-to-one, but into what was then called a, quote, intergalactic communications network. That became the proposal, originally written in ink, for what was called ARPANET. And then almost exactly 50 years ago, ARPANET was made real and we were thrown into the internet age. And it, of course, has changed everything from our news, our politics, our business, our personal relationships. But since then, there's been a couple of core changes that we need to wrap our heads around. The first is a shift in what's on the hardware side. All those computers that were lashed together, whether it was the very first one on the left there, which was the first server for ARPANET, it's about the size of a refrigerator, to the one that a young Mark Zuckerberg is using in that photo to create what he originally called Face Mash. That's him in his dorm room almost exactly 15 years ago. All of those computers lacked what are known as sensors. They lacked the ability to gather information beyond the computer. Now, every smartphone has at least 25 sensors on them. Some of them are pretty obvious. The camera, taking images of the world beyond. Some of them lie in the background. Geolocation, where in the world is this computer, therefore where is the user of it? And then of course every message moving back and forth has metadata on top of it that gives you even more sensor information. Now that leads to another core shift that Zuckerberg was at the center of, which is the rise of what's sometimes called Web 2.0, or more popularly social media. It's the idea that we can all be not just collectors of information with these sensors, but also individual distributors. And that truly is a communication revolution, and a revolution that brings together two types of past historic revolutions. When we think about new communication technologies, they were always one of two types. They either brought together two people at a distance in a new way, telegraph, telephone, or they allowed one person to reach many in a fundamentally new way, printing press, radio, TV, broadcasting out. What social media did is brought those two types together, where you could speak to the crowd, but also simultaneously communicate one-on-one. And that's not just the revolution, that's the very appeal of it. There's a fascinating quote that's been said almost word for word by three wildly different people. Donald Trump, a businessman turned celebrity turned politician. LeBron James, a sports figure turned celebrity turned businessman, to a top recruiter for ISIS, a teenager turned terrorist turned celebrity. Each one of them said the reason they like social media is, quote, it's like owning your own newspaper. And think about what they meant by that. You get to collect the news, you get to tell to the world the story, the news that you want. Now, that has led to a shift, not just in the story of the internet, but its impact on news, politics, and war. And there's two ways to think about this of what we're calling LikeWar. The first is the idea that this space may have begun as a way for scientists to communicate and then the rest of us to link up. Then it became big business, as the story of Mark Zuckerberg illustrates. But then, as we wove in news and politics, It's begun to feel like a war zone. Almost every event has some kind of online battle around it, whether the event is an election, whether the event is a sports game. We have this back and forth. But there's something else. We spent 5 years tracking how groups around the world were using social media, groups that ranged from teenagers in Chicago to teenagers in Syria, from terrorists to Russian disinformation warriors to drug cartels to celebrities, you name it, all around the world, wildly different backgrounds. And what we found is that despite all of this diversity, this space has become not just like a war zone, it's actually become a new mode of conflict itself. If you think of cyber war as the hacking of networks, LikeWar is the hacking of people on the networks by driving ideas viral through a mix of likes, shares, but also lies. And just like in cybersecurity, what happens on the network does not stay there. It has impact on the world beyond, affecting everything from whether people turn out to vote, to whether they join a terrorist group or not, to how they live their lives as teenagers. It is a weird, wild place where ISIS's top recruiter is copycatting Taylor Swift, or Russian military intelligence units are using the very same digital tools to sabotage elections that other people are using to convince people to go to movies. But it was the same thing in cybersecurity, where you saw teenagers, bank robbers, and military intelligence units all using the same tactics. Why should we expect it to be different when it's on top of the networks? So what we found, though, was not just that it's a war zone, a domain, but just like in other domains, there's a series of rules that structure what happens there. And these rules are essential to understand whether you are in government, military, business, or operating as individuals today. The first one of these rules is, as the X-Files told us, the truth is out there. In a world of mass collection and mass distribution, it's very difficult to keep anything secret. Indeed, as one CIA officer put it to us, quote, "All secrets now come with a half-life." And we can see this kind of collection and sharing in all sorts of different ways. Some of it is deliberately done. The average millennial will take more than 26,000 selfies during their lifetime. They'll take it in the darndest of places, like there in the middle of the Battle of Mosul. But it's not just those crazy youth. We have the very first American president to have used social media before he entered the White House, not even Barack Obama. Donald Trump started as a 61-year-old, and yet he brought in over 40,000 bits of data of not just his actions, but his thoughts, and not just his overt thoughts, but as one of the key things coming out of Cambridge Analytica, it was how you mine that to figure out someone's psychology, their tells, their influence points. This kind of sharing can also happen undeliberately. My favorite example of this is that people were looking at a heat map from exercise apps. Anybody wear an exercise app tracker in the room? So they were looking at where in the world were people using this, and they found that there was an interesting little dot in East Africa of exercisers. And they zoomed down on it, and this is what they saw. Essentially, what it was is a CIA black site, a classified location in East Africa, was revealed by the guards doing their morning jog, and as you see, it provided a near-perfect perimeter outline of this once classified location. Now, this is not just hitting military operations. Think about the difference between, we're a little after the anniversary of the D-Day invasion. Think about how that was kept secret, everything from when the operation to where the targeting was, to the bin Laden raid, which was live tweeted by a Pakistani cafe owner who was up late at night in Abbottabad, heard the helicopters come in, and did the new natural thing. He went online to complain. And his complaints doubled as these live battlefield reports. First helicopter, second helicopter, explosion. Gosh, none of this ever goes on in Abbottabad. And then at the end of his train, he said, oops, I'm the guy who live tweeted the bin Laden raid. This has hit not just military operations, it's hit politics. Think about the activities of politicians and how they would operate where once they feared that someone in the crowd might have a camera taking images of their mistakes. Now, they would be mad if there weren't hundreds of cameras in the crowd documenting everything that they were doing. In fact, in our election in the United States, we have one candidate, Beto O'Rourke, who has literally broadcast himself not just on stage, but visiting the dentist. It's changed how we operate. But that leads to rule number 2. The truth may be out there, but it can be buried underneath a sea of lies. And that is the essence of everything from Russian disinformation operations to how corporations are dealing with crisis management, to how teenagers deal with this space, and importantly, how it's hitting domestic politics. In the United States, the most controversial example of this is the 2016 election. And I think you should look at it as akin to the Spanish Civil War back in the 1930s, as sort of a test ground that others are looking at. We saw, like in every previous election, that where there were email use, hacking into networks. That had always happened before, always happened in a bipartisan way. Obama and McCain campaigns got hacked. Obama and Romney campaigns got hacked. What was different about this? Well, we saw hacking, but beyond the theft of information, what really mattered was the distribution of information. So it starts out with Guccifer 2.0 there. It was a purported Romanian hacker. We now know it was Grucifer. It was GRU, Russian military intelligence. And then what gave it impact was sites like Tennessee GOP there. It's a little bit small for you to see, but Tennessee GOP was someone who was saying, I'm a Tennessee Republican, quote, I love God, I love my country. We now know that the country that they loved was Russia. They were mid-20s, someone working in what was known as the Internet Research Agency. Now, they posed as an individual Tennessee Republican. At its high point, that single account had over 177,000 followers. Anyone in the room have that much? If so, the ASPI folks want you live tweeting about this event. That, though, was a fascinating number in 2 ways. The first, that individual account had 10 times the number of followers as the official account of the overall Tennessee Republican Party. But that's not the key number. The key number is that on Election Day 2016, it was the 6th most read account. Not the 6th most read of the more than 3,000 documented Russian sock puppet accounts. These are ones where there's a person posing as someone else. Not the 6th most of the more than 60,000 Russian bot accounts. That's when there's an algorithm chirping away, driving overall trends. It was the 6th most overall. Why? Because it was being retweeted out with people with hundreds, or in the case of retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, and now convicted felon, hundreds of thousands of followers. What's important about this is that social media is not like Las Vegas. What happens there does not stay there. And a key part of that impact is how it hits other media. Over 90% of professional journalists, everything from newspaper reporters to the bookers for radio talk shows to the hosts of TV news, over 90% of them use what's happening online to determine what story to cover, what angle to take on the story, who to interview for the story, and then based on its performance, whether it's trending or not, whether to double down and revisit it. So that's where it has this magnified impact. And then you layer on top of that the purchasing of ads, which again we now know was greater than at the time understood. On Facebook alone, over 143 million Americans, that's half our population, was unknowingly exposed to Russian propaganda via Facebook ads. That's where we get this kind of scale of impact both online and offline. But please, don't just see this as an American-only issue. We know that it's hit everything from Brexit to the Brazilian election to, I would steer you in particular to ASPI's great report on hacking democracy, where since that election, we've seen over 20 different nations' elections targeted by foreign disinformation campaigns, which layer into domestic side. But don't just think of this as an election-only issue. We've seen it hit all sorts of different realms. For example, I was recently in Canada where they saw its impact in helping drive viral extremism and influence someone to carry out a mass shooting, which then this was the Montreal shooting, which then the Christchurch shooter cited as their model for inspiration and that they wanted to repeat and follow it. We've seen it operate outside of realms of politics. For example, Nike was the target of what you would call a AstroTurf movement. An AstroTurf movement is a simulation of a grassroots movement that has a real feel to it. And so in this case, what happened is that a group came together of everything from people who were genuinely upset with Nike and wanted a boycott because of a certain commercial that it had, people that were alt-right trolls kind of looking to make trouble, people that were looking to profit off of clicks, and finally those good old Russian bots, all jumping in together to drive viral a boycott movement against this corporation. These tactics, though, are like anything else, particularly with low barriers to entry. They're inspiring, they're proliferating. My favorite example of this is, do we have anyone in the room who saw the movie A Star is Born, or Lady Gaga fans? Come on, raise your hand, don't be ashamed. All right, so what happened is Lady Gaga fans are very passionate, and they saw and they consciously, openly talked about the success that Russia had in sabotaging the US election, and they said, we want to do that too, to rival movies that have the temerity to come out the same weekend as Lady Gaga's movie. And so they organized everything from sock puppets, AstroTurf movement. In this case, they posed as moms who were worried about their kids going to go see the rival movie Venom. And they particularly targeted local TV and radio to convince people to run stories about how bad Venom was for your kids. If you've seen the movie Venom, you know that they didn't have to do this. But the point is that we have a space where we see everything from Lady Gaga fans to Russian military intelligence swinging back and forth. So that leads to rule number 3. We are in a world now where virality trumps veracity. It is more important that something goes viral to its impact than whether it is true or not. It does not mean that the truth can't go viral. We have all sorts of good illustrations of this. Ice Bucket Challenge would be a great example. But the point is that you do not have a tight link between virality and veracity. And that affects, again, everything from what goes viral online, but also its impact on the world. Whether someone joins an extremist group or not, whether they turn out to vote or not, even their beliefs about science and the truth itself. And that this, of course, has massive impact on the world. A great example that we're wrestling with in public health is how we have a variety of communicable diseases that look like they had been defeated roughly around 1998. And then we see the rise of the new forms of the internet and social media, and we've seen a return of all sorts of communicable diseases, for example, like measles. If virality matters so much, we need to understand it. And again, when we looked at cases that range from election disinformation to conspiracy theory like Pizzagate to funny stories like pizza rat jokes, if you remember that, there was a consistency in what went viral or not. They kept having the same attributes. And I'm not going to go into all of them right now, but a great example of this is the notion of planned authenticity. That sounds like a contradiction. How do you plan authenticity? And yet it is a new rule. It's a new feature of whether something goes viral or not. And arguably one of the best at this, maybe even the inventor of it, is Taylor Swift. She called the concept Taylurking. She would do a form of intelligence gathering that entire agencies could not do in the past, mapping out overall trends, but also reaching down to learn micro details of individual teenage life. Everything from whether they broke up with their boyfriend in the last day, whether they passed their driver's license, to literally what t-shirt they are wearing at the time. She collects this information at a personal level, it really is her, and then she reaches down and communicates with them. Sorry to hear about you broke up with a boyfriend. Congratulations on your driver's license. Oh my God, I love your shirt. She's engaging with them like she's their friend. And the new meaning of the term, she is their friend. But she's doing it consciously knowing that the rest of the world is watching. So she's one-on-one, but she's broadcasting. It was the exact same strategy that Junaid Hussain there on the left, ISIS's top recruiter, did. In his case, not trying to convince people to buy tickets to concerts, but instead to travel to Syria to join the organization or to carry out acts of terrorism on their own inside the US. This leads to rule number 4. We have a new set of winners and losers who understand these new rules of the game and are using them to remake the art of the possible in their realm. It's remaking who can be a winning politician or not. In the last session, we talked about the lower barriers to entry. Donald Trump, he says social media is why I won. Don't just believe him. The top campaign strategist in the United States, someone who makes literally millions of dollars advising campaigns, walked us through all the different ways that they measure the likelihood of a candidate winning. This is everything from how much campaign cash you have, how many offices you open up in each state, how many newspapers endorse you, and he essentially said, Donald Trump should not have won the election. It was not a moral or ethical judgment. It was just saying, by the old rules of the game, there's no way he should have been nominated against his 19 rivals, let alone won the national election. But of course they added, he did. It's because all the old rules have changed. It's the same thing in the realm of terrorism. You can't tell the story of ISIS, whether it's its rise, to its recruiting, to its battlefield operations, without talking about how social media has changed it. A great illustration of this is rather than keeping its operations secret, like we did in the bin Laden raid, when it launched the invasion of Mosul, it wanted the whole world to watch. In fact, it literally created the hashtag All Eyes on ISIS. Why? Because driving that information viral of its victory online helped lead to a real world victory where its invading force of 2,500 men rout a defending force of 20,000 because of kind of panic spreading throughout the defending force. It's changed how we think of entertainment and celebrity. All those people on the bottom right, if you are under the age of 30, you have no idea who they are, but they're some of the most influential people in the world. On the bottom right, I love this example in business. There's something taught in business schools, Burger King, or what's it called here? It's a Jack, yeah, all right. So what you see here is an example of a burger chain engaging in an online beef with Kanye West and a rival corporation. That literally makes no sense, except this is now viewed as a case study in how you do it, how you sell beef. All right, but this leads to a final shift that is part of these new winners and losers, is there's new winners and losers behind the battlefield, and heavy lies the crown. Go back to the story of Mark Zuckerberg. Was a teenager, becomes one of the richest people in the world, but he's also become one of the most powerful people in all of war and politics. Why? Because with a simple change of his mind, he can tilt the playing field. The battlefield can be shifted one way or another, whether the battlefield is the news media business, a foreign government disinformation campaign, an extremist operation, the science of vaccines, or a genocide. And I think it's a great example from Myanmar of kind of this challenge that we see all of them facing, including within the companies, where Facebook goes from celebrating the idea that in Myanmar, the internet, for all intents and purposes, is Facebook. They love that story. But then that same platform is used to motivate and coordinate mass killings. Facebook belatedly responds to it and goes from celebrating the use to it changes its mind. Probably a little bit too late, but the point is it goes from saying we love this story of Myanmar to government of Myanmar, we don't like it anymore. We're taking Facebook away from you. Now, that on one hand I think is a good, but put your political science hat on and think, hold it, a single company run, essentially owned by a single person, changed their mind and took away the primary communication medium for a government to its entire population. We're in a very different world now. But it's only going to get more complex. It's only going to get more complex because of greater internet use. Only half the world is online right now. Half the world is still to come. Think about how challenging this has been to nations that have multiple generations of experience with democracy. What about other spaces? But it's also going to get more complex because of some of the new technologies that are going to be talked about in the following panels, in particular artificial intelligence. And this is popularly known as deep fakes, where you use AI to make hyper-realistic imagery. A great example is here. This is what happened when they told a computer, dream up what humans think celebrities look like. And you can see how familiar they are. I find it fascinating that for the male, they chose a Hemsworth. But see how hard it is to tell. This is with no editing. The tells are the ears slightly off on him, and the eyes are slightly off. She's harder to tell. And that's with no editing. Next round, you say to the computer, you know what, fix the ears, fix the eyes, and it becomes almost impossible. Like everything else, this will be used for entertainment. It'll also be weaponized. And this is an example of a still shot from a speech that Barack Obama never gave. And we are not ready for this impact to our world. So in closing, there is a whole series of challenges that need to play out and what we need to do in terms of our policy shifts. Overall, I think we need to approach this much like the lessons that we learned over the last 15 years of cybersecurity or in parallel spaces like public health. There is no silver bullet solution. On the solution side, as long as there is an internet, as long as there is politics and people, we will see these activities. So we're not going to see the end of it. It's more about how do we manage the risks and steer it towards a better direction. And on the silver bullet side, there is no one single response. There needs to be a broad array of responses. And they break down, again, just like in cybersecurity or in public health, government, private sector, individual. In cybersecurity, for example, we don't go, wow, in the US, we have a cyber military command. That means my mom doesn't need two-factor password on her phone. There is a layered approach between all of these. Quickly on the government side, I find it fascinating that 20 democracies have been targeted by this. A minority of them actually have strategies to deal with this. The US government, for example, the Trump administration should be applauded for issuing the very first US national cybersecurity strategy in 15 years. It came out a couple months ago. Yay. It has not a single word on this whole area. Canada, same thing. The Australian, based on my reading, your strategy mentions the problem. It has nothing on what to do about the problem. And so we need national strategies that are, importantly, whole of society. There is a military role here, but there is also a role for the other means of power. For example, why is it of the 20 democracies that have been targeted, we don't have our various State Department or Foreign Affairs working on a grand coalition on this, or an approach that says targeting one is equal to targeting all, or information sharing on ways to defend ourselves. But it also needs whole of society. For example, where is the education system in this, in building digital literacy? There's a role for new laws. How are we updating our campaign laws? In the United States, for example, ads online are controlled by the same laws and codes that shape skywriting. Because back in 2006, when they passed them, they assumed things on the internet would be like smoke in the clouds. Only a couple people would see it, and then it would dissipate. We now know it's literally the exact opposite. To the issue of deep fakes. What are our laws about those? I'm a big believer in the notion of what I jokingly call the Blade Runner rule. We aren't going to be able to ban it just like bots, but like in Blade Runner, we as humans have the right to know whether we're interacting with something that is a bot or not. So a labeling system for these. But most of all, on the governmental side, we can't be in active denial of the problem. We need to constantly be talking about it. Same thing goes for the technology companies themselves. They are akin to parents going through the stages of grief at what has happened to their babies. Originally, they were in denial of the scope of the problem, to now they are in bargaining. I'll do this so that you won't make me do that. And rapidly, they need to be doing everything from red teaming their products. So one quick example on that is Live streaming. The companies were stunned that both teenagers were using live streaming to live stream their suicides, and that terrorists and mass killers were using them to live stream their killing. Anyone who knew anything about teenagers and terrorists could have predicted that, and yet the companies were caught surprised by it. And then finally, in closing, there's the role of us as individuals. Like in public health, like in cybersecurity, it goes after the most vulnerable. We're the weak links. The problem is, unlike in cybersecurity and public health, a majority of the population is the most vulnerable. Over 60% of internet users don't know how the platform companies make money, and that means they are not able to not just merely figure out the difference between real and fake news, they can't even figure out the difference between an ad and a news item. And compare that with the fact that over 70% share out articles without ever having read the article itself. And I bet every person in this room has done that. And that leads to the closing thing that individuals need to do, is approach this in a very different ethical framework. I teach my kids, cover your mouth when you cough. In no way, shape, or form does that defend them. It is all about their responsibility for defending everyone that they network with. Think about the online version of this, whether it's the sharing out, to all of us have a business colleague, a family member, a friend who has shared false news, conspiracy theory, something a little bit abusive or extremist. And how have we reacted to that? Did we react in the same way as if they'd walked up to us and coughed in our face, or did we shrug it off? We're in a world now where you are what you share, but what you share reveals who you truly are. Thank you.